I'll research the key facts behind these Louisiana surname etymologies before writing to make sure the script is accurate. Somewhere in a parish church in South Louisiana, a baptismal register from the 1730s sits in a climate-controlled vault, and on one of its pages, a French priest crossed out a name he could not spell and wrote something else in its place. He did this without malice. He did it because the man standing in front of him spoke German or Spanish or a native tongue that had no letters in the priest's alphabet, and the priest had a job to do. That single decision, repeated thousands of times up and down the Mississippi and across the bayous of St. Bernard and Lafourche, built the surname map of Louisiana as we know it today. It also buried the truth of where half the state's families actually came from. A DNA test doesn't lie the way a rewritten name can. When the results come back, German ancestry lights up on the screen for a family that always called itself pure French. Spanish heritage shows up on a line that swore it was Acadian to the bone, and sometimes, quietly, the results connect two branches of the same name that history spent 200 years trying to keep on opposite sides of a color line. Here are 17 Louisiana surnames where the spelling on the page and the blood underneath it are not telling the same story. Start with Heimel, sometimes spelled Heimel. Say it out loud in St. James or St. John the Baptist parish, and it sounds like any other soft, easy French name on the German coast. It isn't French at all. It's a Gallicized version of the German surname Himmel, which means sky or heaven. In the early 1720s, France's Company of the Indies recruited thousands of farmers out of the German Rhineland with promises of rich land along the Mississippi, then dropped them on a mosquito-infested stretch of riverbank above New Orleans that would come to be called the German coast. French-speaking notaries and priests recorded their births, marriages, and land grants, and when they heard a hard German name they could not spell, they wrote down something their own alphabet could hold. Himmel became Heimel. There's no accent left, no odd spelling to raise a question. A family can carry that name for 10 generations and never once suspect that an ancestor once prayed to der Himmel, not le ciel. If you're a Heimel, the very word your family has spoken as a French surname for 2 centuries, once meant heaven, in a language nobody in that family remembers anymore. Nunez tells a completely different story, and it runs through St. Bernard Parish specifically. Many Nunez families there grew up folded into the French-speaking Creole and Cajun world around them, but the name is Spanish, and it arrived by a very specific historical event. Between 1778 and 1783, while Spain controlled Louisiana, colonial administrators recruited around 2,000 settlers from the Canary Islands, the Spanish archipelago off the coast of Morocco, to build defensive farming communities around New Orleans. They were called Isleños, islanders, and they were settled into 4 locations, including the marshland along Bayou Terreau-Boeuf in St. Bernard Parish. The first documented Nunez in that community was Manuel Núñez de Villavicencio, who arrived with his wife and children in 1779 and became a small farmer and fisherman on the bayou, the likely progenitor of most Nunez lines still living there. The Isleños of St. Bernard were isolated enough that they preserved a distinct dialect of Canarian Spanish for nearly 2 centuries, which is exactly why the rest of Louisiana forgot an entire Spanish-speaking community was living at the doorstep of New Orleans the whole time. If you're a Nunez, your family didn't leave a French village. They left a volcanic island off the African coast, sent by the Spanish crown to hold a swamp. Toups belongs on this list for one of the cleanest paper trails in Louisiana genealogy. It sounds as Cajun as a name can get, and today it's associated with Cajun cooking through chef and cookbook author Alzina Toups and musician Wayne Toups. But every documented Toups line in Louisiana descends from a man named Caspar Dubs, who arrived on the ship La Durance in 1721 from the area around Zurich, Switzerland. French clerks in at the German coast could not render a Swiss-German name like Dubs, so it was reshaped into something a French pen could produce, and within a generation the family was indistinguishable from its Acadian and French Creole neighbors. If your Toups ancestors were on the German coast before Louisiana belonged to the United States, the name in your mouth crossed the Atlantic from the foothills near Zurich, not from France. Serpas, sometimes recorded as Zerpus, Serpas, or Zerpa, is a name that wears its history and its own instability. That scattering of spellings is the signature of a Canary Islander family, part of the same 1778 to 1783 migration that brought the Nunez line, and Isleño heritage societies list all 4 spellings as variants of the same Canarian surname. These families settled alongside the Núñez along Bayou Terreau-Boeuf and kept a Spanish-speaking community alive inside a French-speaking region for generations. Every time a clerk who didn't speak Spanish wrote the name down differently, he left a small fossil of the exact moment that name was heard, copied, and changed again. If you carry the name Serpas in any of its spellings, that inconsistency is not a clerical error to be embarrassed about. It's the paper trail of a Canary Island bloodline. Labranche is one of the most fully documented name translations in all of Louisiana history. because the record of the change survives intact. Lebranche means the branch in French, and it sounds like old Creole aristocracy, which the family became. The Lebranche plantation still stands in St. Rose, and Octave Lebranche served as Speaker of the Louisiana House of Representatives in the 1820s. But the founder of the line was Jean Zweig, a German immigrant from the Bamberg region of Bavaria who arrived on the ship Les Deux Frères in 1721. Zweig means twig or branch in German. In 1737, when Zweig went to sign his marriage contract to Suzanne Marchand, he could not write his own name, so the notary asked him what it meant. On hearing that it meant branch, the notary simply translated it and wrote Jean Lebranche. No mishearing, no phonetic guess, just a direct translation preserved in an official document that still exists in Louisiana Historical Society archives today. If you're a Lebranche, that elegant French name is not a mistranslation. It's a German family's name translated on purpose in front of witnesses nearly 300 years ago. Molero moves the story back to St. Bernard Parish and the Isleño community, where it appears among the recorded Canary Islander surnames documented by heritage researchers alongside Morales, Marrero, and Mesa. It sounds unremarkable, almost like it could belong anywhere, and that's part of why it blends so easily into the general Louisiana surname landscape. But like Nunez and Serpas before it, Molero traces to the same wave of roughly 2,000 Canary Islanders, who Spain resettled around New Orleans between 1778 and 1783 to defend the colony's approaches. Over generations, these families intermarried with the French and Acadian populations around them until the Spanish origin faded from memory even as the name stayed exactly the same. If you're a Molero, the record places your family on a Canary Island before it ever placed them on a Louisiana bayou. Houbre takes the German coast story and gives it an unusual second life. The name descends from Jean-Georges Huber, who arrived from Germany in 1721 on the ship Saint André, and whose surname was recorded in French documents as Oubre, or sometimes Ouvre. Huber is a well-established German occupational surname referring to a farmer who held a hube, a defined measure of huelas, and large enough to support a household, a man of some standing rather than a landless laborer. That same German surname followed a very different path in Pennsylvania Dutch country, where English-speaking record keepers rendered it as Hoover, the family, name that would eventually belong to a U.S. president. On the German coast, Frenchiers did the same job differently and produced Oubre, a name still carried today, including by NBA player Kelly Oubre Jr., who was born in New Orleans. It's the same German root, reaching two different parts of colonial and early American life, reshaped by whichever language happened to be holding the pen. Foles carries an irony that plays out in modern Cajun food culture. It's a Gallicized form of the German surname Foltz, part of the same documented cluster of German coast names that includes Toups, Trosclair, and Heimel. The most prominent bearer of the name today is Chef John Folse, one of the most recognized authorities on Cajun and Creole cuisine, who was born and raised in St. James Parish, on the very stretch of river once called the German coast. The Foltz family, like its German neighbors, gradually intermarried into the French-speaking population until the German origin of the name was no longer part of the family's self-understanding. A surname now closely tied to the public image of Cajun cooking actually crossed the Atlantic from Germany. Hebert deserves special attention because it is, by a wide margin, the most common surname in Louisiana, carried by well over 20,000 people, and it's genuinely, verifiably Acadian. The overwhelming majority of Hebert lines in the state descend from Acadian refugees, who arrived in Louisiana between the 1760s and 1780s. But the name itself is far older than Acadia, and it isn't French in its roots. Hebert descends from the Germanic personal name Heribert, formed from two Old High German elements, Hari, meaning army, and Bert, meaning bright or famous. Put together, it means something close to illustrious warrior or bright army. This is a Frankish name, carried into Gaul by the Germanic tribes whose language and rule eventually shaped early medieval France itself, and it entered common use there centuries before Acadia existed. So the Acadian pride wrapped up in the name Hebert is completely real. But the word itself is a reminder that France was assembling its own identity out of Germanic and Gallo-Roman threads long before any Acadian ever set foot in Louisiana. LeBlanc is nearly as widespread, and its history is heavier. The name simply means the white one in French. And in some American records, it was written outright as white. What defines the Louisiana LeBlanc line isn't the meaning of the word, though. It's the event that brought most of them here. In 1755, the British colonial government began the forced deportation of Acadians from Nova Scotia, an event remembered as the Grand Dérangement, in which roughly 11,000 Acadians were expelled from our homeland. Families were split apart, and people were scattered across the Atlantic colonies, France, and the Caribbean before many eventually found their way to Louisiana over the following decades. The LeBlanc families who arrived here were refugees rebuilding a life out of that displacement, not settlers on a planned migration. If you're a LeBlanc, the French part of that name is authentic, but it survived one of the most significant forced removals in colonial North American history. Guidry shows how a name can shift shape through nothing more sinister than illiteracy and careless copying. The Louisiana Guidry line descends from Claude Guidry, who arrived from France around 1671 and later settled in Acadian, Nova Scotia. Because many Acadians of that era could not write, English and French-speaking clerks recorded the name as they heard it, and small errors accumulated across generations of copying, eventually producing variant spellings including Guidry, Gary, and even Petit Pas in some branches, alongside the original Guidry. In Nova Scotia, members of the Guidry line also intermarried with Mi'kmaq families at a small settlement called Merligesh, meaning that even the purest Acadian lines were already blending with indigenous North American families, well before Louisiana entered the picture. If you're a Guidry, the name was reshaped by other people's hands, and its earliest known chapter in Canada already included indigenous kinship. Broussard is one of the three most common surnames in Acadiana, common enough that an entire city bears the name, and most people assume it's uniformly white Cajun. For a great many families, it is, tracing back to Joseph Beausoleil Broussard, the Acadian resistance leader who helped lead the first organized group of Acadian refugees to Louisiana. But the same surname was also carried independently by free people of color and their Creole descendants throughout Louisiana's history, families whose graves and church registers carry the identical name. Louisiana's rigid racial classification system was never actually equipped to track a surname that ran down both sides of the color line it was supposed to enforce. So for generations, official paperwork simply looked away from the connection. Modern DNA testing is now reconstructing exactly the family ties that older records deliberately left undocumented. If you're a Broussard, that iconic Acadian name may connect you to relatives on a branch of the family your grandmother's stories never mentioned. Guillory follows a similar pattern rooted specifically in St. Landry Parish. It derives from Guillaume, the French form of William, and it's carried by more than 8,000 people in Louisiana today, usually filed alongside other names associated with the state's French Creole community. But Guillory has a well-documented history among free people of color specifically. Martin Guillory was a prominent Creole of color in St. Landry. Parish, who served in a Civil War-era militia unit and later accepted a federal commission, and communities of free Creoles of color named Guillory owned land, farmed, and built their own churches in the prairie parishes before the Civil War. As with Broussard, descendants from the white and Creole of color branches of the Guillory name are often, on testing, found to be kin, exactly as parish sacramental registers quietly recorded at the time. Ardouin belongs on this list because of music as much as genealogy. If you've ever heard Cajun or Zydeco music, you've heard this name because Amédée Ardouin is widely credited as one of the founding figures of both genres and is often called the first Black Cajun recording artist. He was a Black Creole accordionist who performed and recorded in the Louisiana French dialect shared across racial lines in the prairie parishes. And his recordings from the late 1920s and early 1930s laid groundwork that both Cajun and Zydeco musicians built on for decades. Ardouin is, at its root, a French surname, but in Louisiana, it is overwhelmingly associated with Black Creole families, a lineage that produced music now claimed as a shared inheritance by white and Black Louisianans alike. Ardouin performed alongside white Cajun musicians during an era when that kind of collaboration carried real danger, and by most historical accounts, the racial tension surrounding his career contributed to the beating that led to his death in 1942. Chenier carries the same thread forward. It's a French surname meaning oak grove, common across the prairie country around Opelousas and Lake Charles, and it belongs to Clifton Chenier, internationally recognized as the King of Zydeco and a Grammy winner. Like Ardouin, Chenier's family is part of Louisiana's Black Creole community, and the accordion and washboard music tradition he carried onto world stages, performing alongside his brother Cleveland Chenier on the Rubbard, grew directly out of the same rural, French-speaking, racially mixed prairie culture that produced the Guillory and Ardouin families. The surname sounds purely French because it is purely French, but the people who made it internationally famous were building a musical tradition. History often mislabeled as belonging to one racial group alone. Verdun takes the story back further than any European language. It sounds entirely French, and on paper it is, but Verdun is one of three founding surnames of the United Houma Nation, alongside Courteau and Billiot, according to both the tribe's own history and independent research by Federal Bureau of Acknowledgement researchers. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Frenchmen married into Houma families along Bayou Terrebonne, and their French surnames, including Verdun, Billiot, and Dardar, were carried forward as core Houma family names, even as the community remained fundamentally native. The United Houma Nation counts more than 19,000 members today and has sought federal recognition for decades without success, in part because names like Verdun made an intact native community look, on paper, like just another French Creole family. If you're a Verdun, the name is French, but the bloodline it has carried since before Louisiana existed is Huma. Fontenot closes the list, and it may be the name that says the most, because it refuses to sort into any single category at all. With roughly 14,000 people carrying it, Fontenot is one of the most common surnames in Acadiana, meaning little spring in French, and it is worn at the same time by white Cajun families proud of their Acadian roots, and by black Creole families with an equally deep claim to it. Canray Fontenot, one of the most celebrated Creole fiddlers in Louisiana history, was black, and Adam Fontenot, a Creole accordionist of the same era, is remembered as a peer to Amédée Ardouin himself. Meanwhile, thousands of W.H.I.T. Fontenot families fill the parishes of Acadiana with an equally sincere connection to French heritage. Both communities are buried under the same name in the same churches, and no test result can cleanly separate them because there was never a single bloodline to separate. If you're a Fontenot, the name proves not one ethnicity, but the opposite, that Louisiana's bloodlines braided together tightly enough that a surname alone can never fully sort them. None of these 17 names is proof of anything on its own. A surname is a starting point, not a verdict. What actually confirms a family story is the combination, a DNA result pointing toward the Rhineland or the Canary Islands or a native community along the Gulf, a family story that never quite lined up with the documented facts, a parish register that spells the name 4 different ways across 4 generations. French clerks translated German names, mangled Spanish ones, and absorbed native and Creole of color families into records that were never built to hold their full complexity. The color line drawn across Louisiana's history tried to keep white and black Creole branches of the same surname apart on paper, even while they remained, in fact, one family. And the popular idea of Louisiana as simply French country swallowed all of it, German, Spanish, native, and Creole alike, into one convenient story. The names themselves never stopped telling the truth. They just needed someone to ask the right question. If one of these 17 surnames is sitting in your own family tree, that's not a coincidence worth ignoring. It's an invitation to actually look. Somewhere in a Louisiana parish archive sits a baptismal register from the 1730s, where a French priest crossed out a name he couldn't spell and wrote something else instead. He wasn't being cruel, he simply couldn't render the German, Spanish, or native sounds coming out of the person standing in front of him, so he wrote what his own alphabet aloud. That one habit, repeated for over a century by clerks and priests across the German coast, the Isleño settlements of St. Bernard, and the bayous of Terrebonne, quietly rebuilt the ethnic map of an entire state. Today, a DNA test can undo in minutes what those pens did over generations, and the results routinely surprise families who assumed they were purely French. Take Heimel. It sounds gently Acadian, but it's a Gallicized version of the German word Himmel, meaning heaven, carried by farmers lured from the Rhineland in the 1720s with false promises of easy land. Toups traces to Caspar Dubs, a Swiss immigrant from near Zurich, whose name a French clerk simply couldn't write. Labranche is even more precisely documented. In 1737, a German immigrant named Jean Zweig, unable to sign his own marriage contract, told the notary his surname meant branch, and the notary translated it on the spot into French. Hubre descends from Jean-Georges Huber, the very same German surname that became Hoover in Pennsylvania Dutch country, just reshaped by a different language on a different frontier. Folse is a French rendering of Foltz, a name now tied, ironically, to celebrated Cajun chef John Folse, born on the old German coast itself. Spanish ancestry hides just as thoroughly. Between 1778 and 1783, Spain shipped roughly 2,000 Canary Islanders to Louisiana to defend New Orleans' approaches, settling many along Bayou Terre-aux-Boeufs in St. Bernard Parish. Their descendants carry names like Nunez, Malero, and Serpus, the last of which survives in half a dozen spellings. Zerpas, Serpus, Zerpa, each variant a fossil, of the moment some clerk heard the name and copied it wrong again. These families kept a distinct Canarian Spanish dialect alive in isolated bayou communities for nearly 2 centuries, hiding in plain sight beside French-speaking Louisiana. Even the most Acadian names on the list have foreign roots. Hebert, the single most common surname in the state, is authentically Acadian in ancestry, but the word itself descends from the Germanic Heribert, built from Hari, meaning army, and Bert, meaning bright, a Frankish name carried into Gaul long before Acadia existed. LeBlanc really does trace to Acadian refugees, but its history is grim rather than romantic. Most LeBlanc families arrived in Louisiana as survivors of the 1755 Grand Dérangement, the British expulsion that scattered 11,000 Acadians across the Atlantic world. Guidry descends from Claude Guedry, whose name was reshaped through generations of copying by clerks who couldn't write it consistently, in a family that had already intermarried with Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia. Some names refuse to sit on one side of Louisiana's old racial lines at all, Broussard and Guéry are both carried by white Cajun families and by Creole of color families with equally deep roots. Branches, the state's rigid classification system tried to keep separate on paper while they remained, in fact, one family. Ardouin and Chenier belonged to black Creole musicians, Amédée Ardouin and Clifton Chenier, whose accordion and fiddle tradition became the shared root of both Cajun music and Zydeco. Fontenot may be the most telling name of all, carried at once by thousands of white Cajun families and by celebrated black Creole musicians like Canray Fontenot. It cannot be sorted into one ethnicity, because it was never one bloodline to begin with. And Verdun, despite sounding entirely French, is one of the 3 founding surnames of the United Huma Nation, a native community whose French-sounding names made it harder for generations for outsiders to recognize an intact indigenous people living along the Gulf. No single surname proves anything by itself, but combined with a DNA result, a family story that never quite added up, or a name spelled 4 different ways across 4 generations, these names become doorways. French clerks translated away German words, mangled Spanish ones, and buried native and Creole of color lineages inside records never built to hold them. The names survived, anyway, waiting for someone to finally ask what they meant. Take a moment to check your own test results against what you just heard, and if you found a name here that matches your own family, drop it in the comments and tell us what your DNA actually showed. If this kind of Louisiana history interests you, subscribe for more deep dives into the state's hidden bloodlines.